Leaders do not avoid, repress, or deny conflict, but rather see it as an opportunity. Warren G. Bennett said that once. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast, episode 59, Using Conflict for Good. Nathan Regier. Welcome one, welcome all to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. It's your host and founder again, Scott McCarthy, and thank you to the thousands of you out there listening to this show. It's much appreciated by me, for sure. And if you're new to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast, well, welcome to you as well. You've come across a podcast which revolves around simply one thing and one thing only, and that is how we can make you a better leader with practical advice, tips, tricks, guidance, and everything in between, okay, folks? That's what we're all about here at the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. And before I dive into today's episode, just got one, let's say minor, no, not really minor. Got one announcement. It's roughly about 8 pounds and change in size at the moment, and that is Julie, my wife Julie, and I were happily announced that we had a baby boy just a few weeks ago. So if you notice that recently, kind of not been as consistent as what I've been in the past, well, that's the good reason for it. So with that, though, the announcement is that things are going to change up a little bit with the podcasting here at Moving Forward Leadership Podcast, and won't be able to be as consistent as I've been in the past, obviously with a brand new infant in the house, along with a 3-year-old toddler. You can imagine that things are a little bit crazy. And not to mention, this is my side hustle. This is something I do out of goodness of my heart. It is not what I do day in, day out. If it was what I did day in, day out, you wouldn't have seen any change whatsoever. That's for sure. So that's how things have changed for me, and these are some of the impacts that are going on with the podcast. One other big impact is that I'm going to be slowing down on the interviews per se for the next while, because with the infant in the house, it's just too unpredictable to be able to schedule interviews on my off time and get them done. So for the time being, I do have a couple left in the hopper, like today's, to push out. But for the time being, I'll be slowing down on interviews and focusing mostly on myself speaking. And let me know what you think about that. Do you prefer interview shows, or do you just prefer me talking to you about various leadership tips, tricks, advice, guidance, and how to, navigate this crazy world that we live in as leaders? It'd be great. Just reach out any way possible. Facebook, Twitter, email, I don't know, however you want. Just feel free to reach out and let me know what you think of the change. Anyway, today's episode, we're going to be talking about conflict. And, the world is just revolves around conflict. You might as well say it. It completely revolves around conflict. Everywhere you go, there's conflict present. Heck, maybe you listening to this podcast is a conflict. Maybe you're in the car with your significant other. The other person wants to listen to the radio. You're like, I'm listening to this podcast. And that could potentially be causing a conflict. So as leaders, we need to know how we can basically navigate through conflict in the best way possible, so that we get positive results at the end. And that's what today's episode is all about. For today's episode, I went out and found Nathan Regier. Nathan is a author of Conflict Without Casualties. He's also CEO and founding owner of Next Element. It's a global leadership and training and certification, which basically specializes in communication and conflict management skills, okay? He's also an expert in social, emotional intelligence, leadership, positive conflict, neuropsychology, and so on, and so on. So yes, I definitely had to bring him on the show for you guys. Today's episode, we discuss various elements, perspectives of conflict, why leaders struggle when it comes to conflict, what leaders can do to resolve conflict directly between them, a coworker, or a subordinate, some practical ways leaders can resolve conflict between multiple subordinates, some coaching techniques, and then how we can finally apply to turn conflict from a distraction into a resource. And that's the big thing there. You want something positive come out of any conflict, right? So that's what we're diving into today. All right, folks, as always, stick around for the end for my key takeaways. And now sit back, relax, and enjoy my episode with Nathan Regier discussing conflict for good. Nathan, welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Scott. It's great to be with you and your listeners today.
Oh, definitely looking forward to this conversation regarding conflict. But before we dive in, one thing I always like to do with my guests is give a little background on themselves, who they are, how they got to where they are today, and why don't you start us off with that?
Sure. Well, I'm a native Kansas boy here. I'm actually coming to you today from the middle of America, where it's almost 100 degrees today. But I haven't always lived here. I actually grew up in Africa. My parents were missionaries with the Mennonite Church, and so I grew up in an environment in rural Africa in the Democratic Republic of Congo first, and then in Botswana during high school when apartheid was still the governing paradigm in South Africa, and Nelson Mandela was in prison. And so my parents, being with the Mennonite Church, preached nonviolence and pacifism all growing up. So it was kind of ironic that I grew up in a family of focused on peace, but I was in a lot of violent areas in the world. I came back to college here in the U.S., actually went to a small liberal arts college here in Kansas, and then got my Ph.D. in clinical psychology from the University of Kansas, and practiced psychology as a clinical psychologist for about 11 years before I started the company that I'm with now, which is Next Element. I live here in Newton with my wife, and I have 3 kids. One of them still at home, 2 are in college, all 3 daughters. So we're going to talk about drama a little bit today. We get our fair share of that. And I don't know. I love to barbecue. I'm on a competition barbecue team.
Nice.
I love to play tennis. I love to do woodworking and camp and hike in the mountains and spend as much time outside being active as I can.
No, it's awesome. Maybe we will have a sidebar discussion after the show about barbecuing, because I'm not a competition barbecuer, but I definitely enjoy my barbecue. I'll even barbecue in minus 30 degrees Celsius up here in the winter time.
There's never a bad time.
Never. You know, when you got to take a shovel and clear the snow away from around your barbecue to get at it, you know you're dedicated, right?
I think the harder you have to work, the better it tastes.
Oh, touche. Well played. Awesome. I love it. Love the intro, and it's so interesting people I get to meet and talk to. And you're another great example. So cool. Again, welcome to the show. Not before. I guess the first question that I have for you today is what is your perspective, or how do you look at / define conflict? And I guess that would be a good way to shape the framework for today's conversation.
Yeah, great question. And conflict is a large part of my professional career and what I focused on. So it's something that I've been around and spent time thinking about and working on a lot. And I think it's really interesting how conflict has gotten such a bad rap. We were talking about Googling things earlier, and if you Google conflict, you know how Google will kind of autofill phrases and words that go along with it. And if you do that, some of the most common words you'll see are the words mediation, reduction, management, control. It's kind of like all those words send the message that conflict's like a bad thing.
Negative connotation, right?
Yeah. And so we don't see it that way. The way we see conflict, my perspective is that conflict is simply a gap between what I want and what I'm experiencing at any point in time. And it could be super simple. It could be as simple as, I want to be at work at 8 o'clock and join the staff meeting. What I'm experiencing is 12 people in front of me at the Starbucks line. And we got a problem. That's conflict. And so it's neither good nor bad. It's simply that gap. But what we do know is that gap definitely generates energy. And I don't know about you, but I feel that energy in my body, in my neck. Sometimes my stomach's tight. Sometimes I feel it like racing heart, or I can't sleep at night. So there's a ton of energy inherent in this gap. And even at that point, it's neither good nor bad. So for my perspective is that conflict is neither good nor bad. It's this gap. It contains a ton of energy, and there's really a huge opportunity there if we change how we look at it.
No, it's super interesting, and I tend to agree with it. Like, I believe that lots of great things can come out of conflict, and lots of great world changes have come from various types of conflict. And it doesn't have to be, the extreme grosso modo conflict, war or something, but just two challenging ideologies to push each other forward. Think harder, think higher, and resolve some crazy problems out in the world today. So, definitely.
Yeah, and the world is diverse. Diversity is part of the grand design of the universe, I think. I mean, I think it's not on accident that people are different from one another. And so if we're going to be different and we're walking around with different ideologies, different skin color, different backgrounds, different, belief systems, then there's going to be conflict. And it's probably meant to be. So we have a great opportunity.
No, definitely have to agree with all that. So you've talked about how conflict is neither good nor bad. It's just simply a gap. But why is it that, especially leaders, why do we struggle most when it comes to conflict? Like, is there a reason for that? I generally see a lot of people who try to avoid it altogether, which to me just it makes the problem exponentially larger. But in your opinion, why do leaders struggle when it comes to conflict?
Two great questions. Why do people in general struggle? And then why do leaders? Because I think leaders have some unique challenges
when
it comes to conflict. Can I answer both?
Absolutely. Your show.
I don't know if I can answer them, but I'll speak to them. Funny, you said that you made a comment about, I like to avoid conflict, and you're not alone. We've had a survey going online about how people deal with conflict, and thousands of people have completed this survey online from all over the world. And there's one question that says, answer yes or no, I compromise to avoid conflict. And over 70% of everybody that fills that questionnaire out says yes. And so it's a global phenomenon that people generally want to avoid conflict, and they'll go so far as to compromise and kind of put their own needs, their own wishes, their own desires on the back burner in order to, quote, keep the peace. So people don't like it, but I think there's just some basic myths that we've grown up with. And all of these myths lead us to see conflict as a really adversarial thing. So, one myth would be that conflict is bad. Another myth is people get hurt when there's conflict. That's why I called my book Conflict Without Casualties, because that's not what we normally expect. And then there's another myth that conflict should be reduced or managed or mediated or controlled. So I think we've learned an adversarial approach just in general, that conflict means there's going to be winners and losers. And so then leaders have a unique struggle, because leaders are supposed to be strong. They're supposed to be invulnerable. They're supposed to have it all together. And to do conflict really well requires vulnerability and requires a state of openness. And that just is antithetical to what leaders kind of have been taught, particularly male leaders.
No, that's very interesting. Yeah. I see it all the time, especially being an Army officer. We have to be that persona, super strong, stone-willed, and not really giving a whole lot.
Even the word vulnerability by itself is like, oh, so you're going to get hurt, you're going to get taken advantage. People are out to get you. You're weak.
Yeah, absolutely,
absolutely.
So, no, awesome. Love those answers. So obviously the world is filled with conflict, and leaders have to deal with that. So what I'd like to dive into is maybe some practical ways that leaders can help deal with conflict within their organization. And the first scenario, I guess, would be directly between them and a coworker or a subordinate, or that could potentially be two questions itself again, those two scenarios. So what are some practical ways that a leader could deal with that type of scenario?
There's a couple of things. The first thing to do is to reframe conflict or this gap energy as an opportunity. And so we go into it with a different frame of mind. And the frame of mind has to be that we make a conscious choice that we're going to seek to be effective instead of seeking to be justified. Because a lot of people in conflict, they're going after that rush, that kind of dopamine rush when they can say, see, I was right, or see, I win, or see, I lose. So that's the second tip is they've got to make a conscious choice to seek effectiveness rather than seeking justification. We spend an inordinate amount of time, all of us, trying to justify ourselves instead of using that energy to be effective. So we've suggested this concept called compassionate accountability, which is to mash together two things that you would not expect would go together. And when a leader is going to engage somebody like a subordinate, practicing compassion and accountability at the same time is the key to conflict that creates instead of conflict that destroys. Because the word compassion comes from the Latin root meaning co-suffer or co-struggle. So compassion is way more than just having sympathy or empathy for someone or, wanting to go help them because they're hurting. Compassion means that the solution is going to come from the two of you working together, not from struggling against each other, which is what we call drama. So compassionate means we're going to struggle together, and accountability means to reach our goals or to meet the standards that we've put out there. And so compassionate accountability means I approach a subordinate maybe that is not performing as I want or hasn't met an expectation, and I come into it with the attitude that we're going to struggle together to reach that goal, and I'm going to seek to be effective instead of feeling justified. And there's specifics to that, but that's kind of that's the basic attitudinal framework that allows us to go into that and have a different outcome.
Right. So if I'm reading you right, and I'll just do this scenario. So I have a subordinate who's not meeting the expectations that I have set out for him. So vice bringing him into my office and then launching, basically how we refer to it in the Army is jacking them up. I'd bring them in and say, hey,
right.
You're not meeting these expectations. What's going on? Is there something I can help you out with? Or is there, something going on at home? Before, doing that approach, vice going and just getting angry. Would that be fair?
We don't. Yeah, and certainly we wouldn't want to go to drama. And we go into drama, we take on one of three kind of behavioral roles and attitudes. We can be the persecutor, and we can jack them up and pretend that they're the problem and we're okay and they're not okay. Or we can play the role of the victim and assume that we're the problem and apologize and fall all over ourselves as if somehow we caused the problem. Or, we weren't a good enough leader. We didn't tell them something. What did we miss? Or we could come in there arrogantly acting as if we're the solution and try to be the rescuer and think that we know what's best to solve someone else's problem when it's not our responsibility to do that. And so avoiding those three roles is critical. But there are three alternative skills that have to be put together in a particular way to do what you're talking about. And it starts with openness. When we experience a gap, we're going to have an emotional response to that gap. And if we're really going to be honest with ourselves and create a safe place for conflict, we got to come clean with ourselves and with the other person about how we're feeling. And this isn't about blaming them for our feelings. This is not about saying, I feel like you're a jerk. It's about saying, I feel anxious, or I feel confused, or I feel angry, or I feel defensive right now. So that's openness. And then resourcefulness is the next step, which is we start to come together around how are we going to work on this gap? Mm-hmm. What information do I have to offer? What questions do I have? What resources do I have to bring? And the difference between being a rescuer and actually being resourceful is being a resource instead of trying to solve the problem. Because ultimately this person, this employee, for example, or subordinate, it's not my responsibility for their behavior. I'm responsible to help encourage them, but ultimately they're the one that has to perform differently. So then we go to persistence, and that's where we get crystal clear about what are the expectations, what are the non-negotiables, what are the boundaries, what principles are at stake. What is this really about? And so compassion accountability is kind of where we do this balancing routine between openness, resourcefulness, persistence, and then come back to open. And we teach leaders how to put those four together in a real specific way to broach the topic of conflict. And so it might be with your scenario, I'm feeling anxious because I want to feel confident that this job's getting done. I go to resourceful and I say, here's the data. It looks like you're a week behind on this project, and here's what that means. I go to persistence and I say, at the end of the day, here are the expectations, and here's why it's so important. Mm-hmm. And then I check back in with that person and say, where are you at with this? How often do we come into a situation and we start straight at persistence and we go point out the inconsistency or the rule that's been broken, or we lift up the guideline or the expectation? Every time I try that with my kids, I fall flat. When I walk into the house and say, hey, you didn't do the dishes. You were supposed to do the dishes, and it's 7:00, and they're like, rah, 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 rah.
Well, but.
Yeah. So starting at persistence by reinforcing boundaries and pointing out where people didn't meet expectations almost always invites defensiveness, and then people feel like it's now adversarial.
Makes sense.
If I come in it open and I walk through the door and say, I'm feeling really tired and I'm really anxious because the house is a mess and I was hoping, to have it clean so that we could spend some time watching our favorite show together tonight, I see the dishes aren't done. I'm curious what your plan is for tonight, because at the end of the day, that's one of your daily jobs that's part of you getting your allowance. Where are you at with this? So now my daughter can tell me, oh, Dad, I'm so sorry. Or she could say, hey, Mom and I talked about we're going to do dinner first, and then I'm going to do the dishes later. And it's like now we can work together to solve this thing.
Wow, lots of great tips in there. The next question I was looking at doing, and maybe you've already even hit on it, but let's see if there's some differences in this scenario. Would a leader go about looking at resolving, or basically like dealing with conflict between two subordinates in a very similar way, or is there other practical tips that you have for them, much like you just had then?
No, the same principle can work really well. So in that situation, the leader would be coaching the two subordinates to start it open and helping them start there, then go to resourceful and get clear about what resources are we going to bring to bear. And then coach them on going to persistence and getting crystal clear about what is this about. And then help them do that. And what a supervisor could help subordinates do is avoid some of the pitfalls, like blaming someone else for their feelings, or trying to come up with a solution without first disclosing their motives. Mm-hmm. So some of those things, definitely a third party can be more of a coach in that kind of a situation.
Awesome. And you actually brought another, to me, a follow-on question. What would be some good coaching techniques that leaders should try to develop to deal with these types of scenarios, mainly in that multiple subordinates having conflict?
Well, we teach some specific coaching strategies that go with what we call the compassion cycle, and that's these three integrated skills of open, resourceful, and persistent. And these coaching techniques have to do with what are some critical choices that we are faced with at each point in the journey. So, for example, when we're at open, the key choice we need to make is to state what we want. Not to expect it, but to just verbalize, what do I want? What is my motive here? And so as a coach, I can really work with someone on recognizing if they're at open, the way to get to resourceful is to state what they want and to articulate that. Then if they're at resourceful, the next step is to be able to move to persistent. Then the next key choice is for them to let go and move on. At some point, they got to make a decision and make a commitment and accept the consequences of the path not taken. I'm sure, in military training, there are critical choice points where you got to make a call, and you don't know if it's the perfect call, but when you make the call, you have to commit to it and you have to let go of the other option. You can't try to hold on to two things. If you try to hold on to two things at the same time, you're going to get paralyzed. And so that's the coach's job at that moment, is to help persons identify what do you need to let go of in order to move on. and claim that next choice in your life. And then once we're at persistence, the next coaching step is to help people get back to open, which means sometimes you just got to stop and listen. Persistence is hard. When we're grinding the grind every day and we're following through those commitments and we're striving for that strategic plan, it's hard. And so sometimes we spend so much time doing that we don't stop and kind of touch base with how is it affecting us psychologically, physically, emotionally. And so there, a coach's job is to help someone kind of take a time out, take a rest break, and reflect on how things are going so they can reset.
Awesome practical advice. And those are all great tips and reasons why I do what I do, to get people to have, these practical tips that they can just go tomorrow and employ it at their workplace. So love it, Nathan. Absolutely love it. I got one last question before we start winding down the show here. Obviously, to me, I always look at things in both sides of the coin, right? You can have a positive outcome or a negative outcome or connotation or whatever. Right. As you talked about, a lot of people look at conflict in a negative form, but we could use that to turn it and apply it and turn it into a resource for the organization and for the people. So what are ways that leaders can achieve that?
It's a great question. And one of the leaders are always tasked with being role models. I think that's one of the best things they can do. And so when leaders are role modeling through their behavior that they're seeking effectiveness instead of justification, that sends a really strong message that the goal here is not to win and lose. The goal is to work together, struggle with each other for an outcome. So I think setting that tone is key. I think it's really critical the leaders set a tone in an organization where failure happens in a place where people can learn and grow, rather than having these attitudes like failure is not an option or failure means that you are a failure. That we need to create a place for experimentation and for people to be safe with their ideas, what they want. Also, leaders, the most common mistake leaders make when trying to get this in their cultures is leaders do too much. I really think leaders typically overfunction because they're so invested in the outcome, but they're not invested in learning how to develop capability in their people. And so they'll fall for this trap of, if it's going to get done right, I got to do it myself. Or, at the end of the day, everybody's looking at me, so I got to make sure no balls get dropped. And if that's the default attitude, then they never really commit to investing in people that they can trust.
They're setting their organizations up for failure.
They are, and they start to own a scope of duties that is 5 FTEs wide. Yep. And it's not fair to the other people who aren't feeling empowered, and it's not fair to their own bodies and their hearts that they're overworking themselves like that.
I'm a huge proponent for delegation, and the audience have heard me talk about it many times and all the benefits to it. This is just another example, and I didn't even prompt you about it. So,
no, effective delegation and those coaching techniques that we teach really help leaders draw that clear line between what am I responsible for and who am I responsible to, and not to cross those lines. So that people are struggling with each other instead of struggling instead of each other, or struggling in place of each other, or struggling against each other.
Awesome. Absolutely love it. Love it all. It's been a short conversation, but it's been a highly effective conversation, Nathan. Thank you for taking your time out. Before we wind down the show, I got one last question for you, and that's a question I ask all my guests. And that is, according to you, Nathan, what makes a great leader?
Great question. I would say great leaders live, breathe, and walk the talk of these 3 basic principles. In every interaction, they send the message, we are worthwhile, we are capable, and we are accountable. And they do not compromise on those 3 beliefs in how they treat themselves or in how they treat other people.
Absolutely love it. I can't agree with you more. It essentially sums up lead by example in my mentor. So again, Nathan, thank you for taking the time, coming out to talk to myself and the audience out there, all things conflict. At this point, I'm going to flip the mic over to you. Where can people find you? How can they follow you? Your book, everything. Feel free to give that a quick shameless plug if you feel so.
Sure.
Mike's
Well,
yours.
my company is Next Element Consulting, and if you look it up on Google, there'll be all kinds of options. You can follow me at Next Nate on Twitter, Nate Regier on LinkedIn. You can even email me at nate@next-element.com. My book is Conflict Without Casualties, a field guide for leading with compassion and accountability. And if you type that word into Amazon or any of the major booksellers, you will find it. Come to our website, you'll find it. And would like to invite all of your listeners, if they're curious, they can follow my blog, which you can see from my website, next-element.com. It's free. I publish once a week on tips for leading with compassion and accountability.
Awesome. And for the audience out there, I will have this as easy as possible for you guys. Again, just go to show notes. If you go to movingforwardleadership.com/59, all those links are going to be there in the show notes for you. Again, that's movingforwardleadership.com/59. Sit back, relax, and stay tuned again for my key takeaways with my discussion with Nathan today. Nathan, again, thank you. Thank you for taking the time and coming out and speaking to myself and the audience.
You are most welcome.
Hey, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that episode there with Nathan, discussing conflict and what it is and how we can get around it, and ultimately what good can come out of it. So, my 3 key takeaways from today's episode there with Nathan. The first one being, conflict is neither good nor bad. It's just simply conflict. It is what it is. I guess the biggest thing is that it all depends on what you make of it, what comes out of the outcome. Do you actually use it as a learning opportunity, or do you let it fester and boil to the point of it becoming destructive? So conflict basically goes in a direction how you, as a leader, shape that conflict. The second one, seek to be effective rather than being right. And I think this one's very important for all of us. We all have egos. We all like to be right. We all like to be the one that's come up with the great solution or whatever. But sometime you need to take a step back and go, you know what? You're right. I'm not necessarily wrong per se, but you are definitely right. So let's go with your train of thought. Vice mine. Because that is the most effective thing for the organization, the situation. Heck, maybe it's your partner. It could be your spouse for you two as a couple. So seek to be effective rather than being right. And then the final key takeaway is failure to learn and grow, right? You need to learn and grow from every conflict that's out there. That is what makes it worthwhile. That is, in the end, what you're looking for in the result of the conflict or the resolution of the conflict. You need to learn and grow. And failure to do so will basically mean failure as you as a leader in basically growing yourself and becoming better every day. Okay? All right, folks. That's all I got. I hope you enjoyed the show, enjoyed the episode. Again, Ben, welcome to the world. He's actually sitting in his little bassinet type thing right in front of me, moaning and groaning as I record this. But welcome to the world, guy, and definitely looking forward to my latest leadership challenge in life. Anyway, folks, that's all. As always, if you enjoyed the show, enjoyed the episode, remember R²S². Rate and review so that people can, find the show and I can go out and help more people become better leaders, because as you rate and review the show, it grows on the various charts out there. Next thing is to share. Share this episode with someone who you believe could use. Maybe they have conflict right now at work or in their life, and they're not too sure how to get through it. Share it with them. Share this podcast with somebody who you think just may enjoy this podcast. And then finally, subscribe. Subscribe so you don't miss another episode. And that's easily done by going to movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. right, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, remember, keep pushing, keep trying, keep moving forward. Take care now.